So, Nathan, welcome back to the podcast. Great to have you back.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Will. That's good to be back.
No worries. And this time we've got you in full video.
Some people are going to have a lucky treat waiting for them, aren't they?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So we're going to explore some of the amazing work you've been doing on the Support the Workers Collective, this resource that's ever growing for medics. But before we look at that, just for those that weren't able to join us for the first installment, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, Nathan?
Yeah, so I'm Nathan Smith. I'm a research fellow at the University of Manchester, doing research on psychology in kind of extreme and high risk settings. So looking at how people perform under extreme stress, basically, what impact it has on their behaviour, how they kind of make decisions, and then the sort of onward implications for their health and well-being when they're in the environment, but also when they come back. So that's a kind of broad overview. My studies kind of focus on lots of different extreme groups, and that might be people in space, Antarctica, on various types of expeditions, some stuff with military, and then a bit of work with extreme medics as well.
And you've worked with medics in all kinds of environments, haven't you? Desert, polar areas, Antarctic, space simulation.
Yeah, I mean, not always medics, but yeah, with quite a few different populations, and then and done quite a bit of work with medics as well through WEM. With operating in various places.
Yeah, great. Well, it's brilliant to have you on board on the team. So, this Support the Workers project, how did this all come about?
Yeah, so about 2 weeks ago, when this kind of coronavirus stuff kicked off, we were thinking, we had a chat, our research group in Manchester, and we're like, okay, we've got some kind of expertise here of, we've been doing this fairly niche research for quite a while, which is a bit kind of left field. And most people kind of ignore you for a long time until actually now we're in this kind of extreme situation where people are having to live in isolation and confinement. And we sort of sat there and went, oh, well, maybe we can offer some insight onto some of this based on this kind of history of kind of studying these people that choose to go to those places. So we wrote a kind of an accessible piece of work that was published in the Psychologist magazine on kind of coping in isolated confined conditions. And that got shared. And then through that work, we were contacted by someone in the NHS to produce a kind of rapid training and education curriculum for workers that were going to be supporting people on the front line of kind of tackling COVID-19. And that was really focused on pulling together the most up-to-date evidence on kind of psychology and behavioural science in extreme pressure situations, and then producing these really rapid kind of briefing notes so that people could quickly get up to speed and know some of the really important things that would inform their work.
Yeah. And what's really powerful is it's all topic based. It's very carefully referenced. It's all evidence based, and the contributors you've got are really real experts in their field. So it's really, really great.
Yeah. I mean, it's been like we were just saying before the call started. It's been sort of a little bit surprising at how many people have been willing to give up their time and just sort of say, actually, yeah, I can contribute to this. And part of that is making sure there's some internal quality assurance, so that all of the stuff that we're producing is going through a rapid peer review. So kind of it's a 1-day turnaround, but it's really important to make sure that we're not missing anything, and just that everything's tight and sound.
We're in an age of information abundance, and the last thing we need right now is more misinformation. There's a lot of rubbish out there, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, and that we don't want to be in that pile. So hopefully we've avoided that.
Yeah, well, you've dodged that, luckily. So, let's dive in. Resilience. That's such a big buzzword right now. Why is resilience so relevant at this current time?
Yeah, I mean, so resilience is something that we hear people say all the time. We need to be resilient. Resilience this, resilience that. I think for a long time it was a fairly unclear or ambiguous term. Like people talk about it, but we don't really. It's hard to put our finger on what it actually is. There's been a bit of progress on that side of things. So from a definitional point of view, we now know that resilience is a kind of dynamic process that results from kind of adversity and stress, and it has lots of different components. So our physiological function, whether we're fit and healthy, our psychological state, so how we think and feel, and our social context is really important for whether we're going to be resilient. So have we got that support network around us? All of those factors will interact and contribute to us being able to respond positively to adversity. Well, it's not that much of a leap to see why that's important at the moment, given that the workers that are responding to the virus are going to face some adversity at some point, whether that's because they're stretched, they've not had much sleep, or they've not had much time to eat, or and over time these things kind of wear. And so at some point there's going to be these kind of difficult situations that we hope people have the resources, those physiological, psychological, and social resources to be able to maintain their mental health in the face of adversity. And that's really what resilience is. It's kind of operationally viewed as a good mental health outcome following some kind of adversity.
And in your article, you distinguish between individual and team resilience. Why are those? Why is that difference important?
Yeah, because they happen at different levels. So you have if you've got a team of 6 people, the team will the resilient function of that team acting as a whole towards this overarching goal will be influenced by the individual resilience of the people within it, and that might be that the team is able to. It's referred to as an emergent property, so it's something that develops from within, and it may be that if you've got 5 people within the team that are demonstrating these kind of resilient responses, and one person is maybe struggling, the team might still be able to be resilient and respond to adversity at that team level quite well. But if you start then having multiple people that are maybe struggling to cope with the demands, the resilient function of the team is going to be impacted. So it's something that emerges from the interactions between the people in the group, and then helps the team function towards achieving their overarching goal. So it's quite important to distinguish between those two.
Yeah. What role do you think leaders in that team have in optimizing the resilience of the individuals in that team?
Yeah, I mean, I think the leadership is crucial, especially in the sort of current situation people are in. We did a brief on leadership, and the thing that we really focused on was the role of the leader in providing this kind of morale and the sort of social support, because the leaders can direct and guide in terms of technical skills, but I think at the moment the critical role of the leader is that kind of transformational view, and really inspiring the people to come on this kind of quite arduous journey with them. And that will contribute to these kind of, from the social side of the resilient function, that input will really shape how people respond.
Yeah. So I presume we need leaders in healthcare right now that are, in order to inspire, they need to be taking a positive approach, or they need to be upbeat about tackling the challenges ahead and not getting mired in all of the uncertainty and doom mongering, etc.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there has to be a sense of realism. There's no point in kind of ignoring the fact that there are going to be tough times, and I think if a leader did that, people would probably be a little bit like, oh, they've got their head in the sand. But I think it's about instilling this kind of positive emotional responses in the people. So trying to instill a sense of belief and hope and optimism, and then if people are struggling, it's helping them counter those negative emotional experiences, but really trying to boost the morale and mood, because we know it's infectious. If you've got a team and someone's really down and low, that can quite easily kind of find its way through the rest of the team, and so kind of maintaining that across the group is really important.
Could be more infectious than the virus itself.
Yeah, some might say. Yeah, but we know that from history, from extreme situations. There's lots of examples of that where morale can carry people through pretty bad situations.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I think resilience has been misused in some senses, in the sense that the whole term resilience means it's like resistant materials. It's this idea of being able to bounce back from adversity, and it somehow, the very semantics of it focuses the emphasis on individuals' need to just toughen up. And in some ways, people have argued that takes away from an organizational duty to those individuals in that team, to care for them and provide the right conditions whereby they can be resilient. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my a good friend and colleague who's done a lot of research on resilience, a guy called Mustafa Sarkar. He has a really nice analogy for this, and he puts this picture on when he does his sort of presentations, and it's a wilting flower, and the idea is that the flower can be resilient, but it requires the environment to be right for it to be so. And so you give it some sunshine and you give it some water, and then it's able to be resilient. But the environment contributes to that resilience as much as the individual. And so you really, you need both. And I think that's really important to highlight that. One, vulnerability is not the opposite of resilience. So you can be vulnerable and be resilient. They're not kind of mutually exclusive. And I think that's quite an important distinction to make. But two, the social context really matters. And so it's important to get that right.
How do you suggest that health workers can embrace their own vulnerabilities when facing all of this uncertainty and potential risk to themselves? What could they do to do that?
So I think one of the really key things at this moment in time is to get that social support network established, and that doesn't mean you need to have lots of friends. It means trying to figure out and understand who are your important sources of support, and you might try and find or identify to you where you want to go to get that support when you need it, and making it explicit. So saying to the people that are potentially going to be the ones that provide that support, if I'm struggling, can I come to you and can we chat about it? So you've already figured out where you can go, and it's not a kind of reactive thing. So there's something proactive there. I think from a leadership point of view, it's that empathetic support. So it's not necessarily about always agreeing with someone's perspective, but saying, I understand you feel that way, and trying to provide that support even if you don't necessarily agree with the way that they feel or behave or whatever it is they're doing. So a leader can lead without necessarily having to always sympathize. It's more finding a route to support those people when they need it.
Okay. And another key theme you touch on in this resource is motivation, and presumably that plays into your ability to be resilient. And I think with a lot of health workers right now are quite motivated. We've been called upon. We've got a massive round of applause last week, which was very nice. But I just wonder how that plays out over the coming months, how we can sustain that motivation, that drive to still be performing at our peak. What are your thoughts on that, Nathan?
Yeah, so motivation is going to be essential for this period of time, and we don't know how long this period of time is going to be. It could be 6 weeks, and things might start to calm down, and that might be it. But it could be that we're still in a similar sort of situation 12 months or 18 months down the road, until like a vaccine's developed or something like that. So having that kind of longevity, which it comes down to being motivated to want to go in every day and perform to a high standard, is going to be pretty crucial. Like you said, at the moment, people are what we'd term intrinsically motivated. You could probably generalize that and say most healthcare workers are kind of wanting to tackle this thing. And what we make a distinction in the brief between different types of motivation. And the one thing that we're clear about is that motivation isn't just how much effort someone's putting in. So it isn't just about persisting and being determined. It's also about why you're doing it. So what's the underpinning reason? And the really high quality motivations are real like enjoyment and pleasure. So some people, although the virus is not necessarily going to be enjoyable, the sense of excitement and buzz and feeling really purposeful that comes with responding is can be intrinsically satisfying. But also knowing that what you're doing is really important and has value is a really strong motivator, and will sustain people to work hard and actually stay happy and healthy when they're doing it. I guess over time, what we could potentially see is a kind of decline in the quality of that motivation. So people may be starting to shift to, potentially maybe resenting having to keep working as hard, especially if other people are sat at home in quarantine, kind of not doing as much, or perceived as being kind of not doing as much. So there's maybe this kind of sense of guilt, because you're feeling that way, but you're having to go in. And potentially then, if we're having to draft other people in and we're having to reward them in some way to do the work, then that's shifting towards a more extrinsic motivation, which we know those lower quality motivations are less good for intentions to persist, avoiding burnout, and some of these other kind of more maladaptive responses.
I do wonder how autonomy is going to play into longer term motivation as the health system gets completely reorganized and health workers are being redeployed in different areas to staff these huge units, like this Nightingale Hospital, 4,000 bedded hospital in the Excel Centre in London. It will be the biggest hospital in the world when it's full. And you just think, working in a system like that, completely outside of your normal remit, that's going to be really challenging.
Yeah, and we know that there's lots of evidence, 30 years worth of evidence with various study designs, from experimental studies, cross-sectional, longitudinal studies. We know that there are some rules about motivation. Obviously, autonomy that you've picked up on is a big one. So having agency and autonomy over our decisions contributes to those higher quality motivations, and it's more likely to sustain us. Being competent, again, we like to feel like we're good at stuff. We like to feel like we're improving. That's going to contribute. Well, if people are deployed to areas, or they're doing work that they're not sure about, or they're maybe leaving feeling like they've not been as effective, then that can be quite damaging. And then connectedness and relatedness, so being part of teams that you feel like you really belong to, you feel connected to the people, that feeds into this kind of good quality motivation.
Yeah, great. And a big part of this, let's move on to team dynamics now. You mentioned the word team. Many of us are used to working in familiar clinical settings with workers that we know well, and we're likely to be forced into new situations with relative strangers and forced to perform very high pressure, high stakes work. How do you think that's going to play out?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing I'd say is, often in these situations people thrive, and so that there's a challenge to be met, and teams will come together and meet it, more often than not. So I think there's that point to kind of get out up front. I think beyond that, there are what are called non-technical skills that can facilitate some of that, and you probably know all about them already. But there are things like situational awareness, the real importance of communication. So making sure that you have a system whereby people can communicate, and that's not just about talking, but it's about maybe active listening. It's about checking understanding. So if someone's asked you something to do something, rather than just going off and feeling like, oh, did I understand what they're saying, is just checking it back and going, okay, have I got this right, before going away and doing it, and really closing the communication loop, so everything's clear and information is being passed effectively. Some of that is going to have to be developed kind of rapidly, and that relies on building trust between team members, and admitting, not knowing if you don't know stuff. And I think one of the issues that our kind of colleagues that tasked us with some of the support the workers work highlighted was, when teams in the current crisis are coming together, there's going to be different cultures, even from across the NHS. There's going to be different cultures that are, the ways of working will be different from different departments.
Different tribes, yeah.
Yeah. So, and some people are used to acting autonomously. Some people are used to acting under guidance. Some people might be used to having a higher status and hierarchy and wanting to be the decision maker, but actually, in some of these situations, they might have to take a step down and be a follower. So it's trying to establish processes that enable that kind of dynamic team interaction to work efficiently, and just, what are the checklists, what are the standard operating procedures that might need to be developed now, that are suitable for this current situation, which might be different to what has been done in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Established hierarchies will be completely upended. We've got retired doctors coming back into the health service. Medical students being rapidly graduated so that they can be on the front line. And many of those retired doctors have been quite senior, and they might suddenly find themselves being a dog's body or run around in a massive 4,000 bedded unit, doing a job that is completely alien to what they've been doing their whole career. It's going to be really interesting, I think.
But with the vision kind of getting people to work towards that same overarching goal, I think it's doable. Yeah. But it's just getting the buy-in and setting the norms. What are we as a team? What are our norms here? And I think something one of my colleagues, when we did a bit of the rapid peer review on some of the stuff we produce, there's a really interesting point made about not taking kind of direct language personally, and I thought it was quite interesting because I think we're lots of us psychologists are very kind of soft, like we want people to have a nice interaction and it to all be very friendly, but there are times where you're going to have to be direct, and it's keeping that in mind of this isn't a personal attack on me, this is the interaction in the context of that I'm in, and some of that might be a bit unusual, especially for some of the junior doctors that might be graduating quickly, being thrown into the.
Yeah, so I trained in ED before I moved to general practice, and the language used, the culture in those two different work environments is very different. General GPs, we're very conversational, very low tone. We're trying to gain the trust of the patients, and when we communicate with colleagues, we translate that communication style along, and it's not the most efficient way of, particularly in a crisis or very immediate situation where it's time critical, it's not the way to communicate. And you talk about closed loop communication, that's the communication style in emergency departments that's most effective. And for people, like particularly GPs that aren't used to talking like that, it can rub people up the wrong way, because you have to look people in the eye and you have to give them, in no uncertain terms, tell them exactly what you need them to do. There's a clear chain of command. And there's no beating around the bush, no pleasantries, no asking them how they feel about it. And amazingly different cultures, and those different worlds are going to collide.
And you want the teams to keep coming back and performing well. So I think that's some of the stuff that might need ironing out. And I'm sure it would happen naturally, but I think some of the work we're doing might speed that up a little bit and just get people ready for that culture shock, maybe.
Yeah. But I really like your idea that we'll hopefully, as a collective, be able to summon the motivation to make that effort to cross those boundaries, those tribal lines within healthcare, that will enable us all to just work together and for each other, and not in a kind of competitive or a way.
I think there's plenty of precedent for that. When it all comes up to making those really tough decisions and having to perform to that high standard, I think often individuals and teams rise to the challenge. And so I think there's lots of things to be positive and optimistic about. And that there will be difficulties, and that's normal. But there's lots of good stuff on the horizon too.
Absolutely. I mean, multi-agency working between different professionals is nothing new, is it? It's been around for a long time. It's just a slight reshift.
Yeah, and the ED colleagues and some of the kind of first responders, that they know that already. They already work in these multi-interagency teams. So I think there's lots of support and evidence out there of how things work. It's just making sure that all filters in, especially with things like the Nightingale Hospital, which have come together very quickly. And just making sure that all those processes are established and in place.
Absolutely. And one thing that good teams do is they, as well as reflect, planning forwards and being able to resolve conflicts and disagreements, they also reflect back on their own performance and think about how they can continue to improve. And that forms the basis of a debrief after an incident. and you've written about this on your site. Tell us why the debrief is so important, Nathan.
Yeah, so the debrief, the performance debrief, sometimes referred to as a lessons learned or after action review, is there's plenty of evidence. So there's a really good meta-analysis done a few years ago, which evaluated all the evidence of debriefs and how they can enhance performance for teams. And there's a sort of 20 to 25% improvement in team performance when debriefs are done. So that as an intervention, it's pretty rapid. It's not very expensive. It takes a little bit of time. So that 20 to 25% improvement is based on a kind of rough 18-minute debrief. So it's not too much of an investment. The debrief process has a few components, and it's really designed as a kind of active, like, learning self-discovery process. So it's not just about a leader giving you feedback and you just sort of sitting there and taking feedback, but it has to have some kind of active involvement of the people that are involved. So ideally there'll be multiple perspectives shared. There'll be some way of logging and monitoring the lessons learned, with the view of guiding people towards some kind of development. So, like, what did we do well? What didn't we do well? Where are we going next? How can we apply those lessons in the future? So there's a kind of process to it. We talked about it in the brief and provided a few pointers in terms of how people might do a debrief, what leaders could do to make sure people have the opportunity to speak up, and kind of it really try and involve people's perspective. So I also am aware with one of the collaborators on this project got in touch and said they've been doing another review looking specifically at the role of debriefs in team resilience. And again, they found the same thing. So a fairly good effect size of doing debriefs on resilient team performance, as well as performance itself, but this specifically focusing on resilient function within teams. So there's a kind of performance and health aspect to these debrief processes.
Yeah, in my experience, unfortunately, the debrief is one of the first things to go when there's operational pressure and the workload starts to ramp up. So you think that it's worth the time investment for teams to have a little time out and just think about what's happened and reflect on that.
Yeah, and so we're quite explicit in there saying that there's not going to be opportunity for a debrief every time, but what leaders could try and do is really identify the value of the debrief, frame it as an opportunity to learn. So it's not about being judgmental, and really try and set some time aside regularly to do them. One of the things that's suggested is for leaders to try and develop the skills to do a 5-minute debrief. So rather than that 18-minute kind of average length, can you develop the skills to do a rapid performance debrief and really get it concise, so that you've got a kind of real quick fire way of getting feedback, getting input, and logging those lessons learned, which we should be more manageable than trying to set aside 20 minutes to do it, which might be unfeasible.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so really, time efficient debrief. I know there's been a lot of work, particularly in very critical incidents where perhaps somebody's died or it's been a very emotive event. There's been a lot of work on the role of debrief in future PTSD for those involved. And in the past, the advice was that there should be some kind of structured debrief to mitigate against that. Has that thinking changed?
Yeah, so things have moved on quite a bit. There's been a couple of systematic reviews done the past few years looking at this issue of trauma debriefs specifically. So these are slightly different to the performance debriefs we just spoke about. Yeah. Like you highlighted that the kind of when they're delivered is after these potentially traumatic events. The evidence is pretty clear that doing structured trauma debriefs immediately after these types of incidents is not good. It can actually have, there's no evidence to suggest it works, and it can actually have an adverse effect. So it can compound the trauma and make it worse. So doing these structured trauma debriefs is not, it's not in the NICE guidelines. They say avoid it. The Psychological Trauma Society don't advocate for it. And the person that we had expert review the brief, Professor Neil Greenberg, who's an expert in trauma, was very clear about this, is that it's not advised. What what is advised is peer support, some kind of maybe some psychological first aid type support, but it's more focused on the social peer support aspects, which is known to bolster resilience and kind of protect against some of these potential kind of adverse effects later down the line. What leaders could do and managers could do is to keep an eye on it. So a bit of watchful waiting and just observe for a month or so and just see how things kind of play out. Most people, by far the majority of people won't develop PTSD symptoms after trauma. The relative percentage that do is quite small. Of course, some people will struggle. But I think, this like watchful period for that first month or so is what's recommended at the moment.
Okay. And just one last topic I'd love to touch on as well, Nathan, if you've got time, is this concept of moral injury. And we are faced with some unprecedented, that word's totally overused at the moment, but unprecedented decisions and health rationing as a result of the very finite resources that we'll have and the patient load. And clinicians having to make some very, very difficult decisions on who they allocate those resources to. We're talking about denying younger people with no comorbidities the opportunity to have ventilation or intensive care support. I mean, are there any key pointers or insights you could give clinicians to help guide them with this?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that when we put this work together, we identified is so moral injury is a fairly emergent research area. So we've sort of known about moral injury for quite a long time, but as a research topic and as a construct, it's fairly new, and we're still researchers that are working on this topic are still figuring out exactly what it is and what contributes to it. There's some pretty good evidence that it has a moderate association with PTSD. So those things can sometimes associate, but moral injury is not a recognized mental illness in and of itself. So it is an experience that comes from kind of violation of your moral or ethical code for those reasons you highlighted, lack of resources, having to make tough decisions. I think similar approaches to PTSD management are probably helpful. So, there's people that are reluctant at the moment to recommend clinical intervention in moral injury just because they're not quite sure the best way to manage it. So some of the PTSD approaches are probably good, that peer support, social support, making sure people have access to their support networks and can communicate about it. I think pre-briefing people, so making sure that they are aware that this moral injurious experience could occur is really important. So being quite explicit about this is what might happen, and trying to get people prepared for it so it doesn't come as a shock when it does or if it does happen. That's usually quite a good way for lots of these psychological factors. Is if people have the knowledge in advance, they can mentally get themselves in a space where they're ready for it, or at least aware that this could be a response, and that can be quite helpful. But yeah, if people do experience these potentially moralist injuries, they will be quite hard.
Okay. Well, that's been really useful, Nathan. Is there any final thoughts that you had? Any other kind of practical or actionable things that you think would be really helpful for medics on the front line at the moment?
I would recommend going and just spending sort of 10 or 15 minutes having a skim through the website, just because I think there's probably some quite useful stuff on there that it is quite practical. So there's some kind of real key recommendations. I guess from all of the stuff we've talked about today, preparation is really key. So if as a medic or a frontline worker you end up in self-isolation because you've got symptoms, really try and take that time to prepare yourself for what lies ahead. This thing will still be there after 2 weeks of isolating, so people are going to need to be fresh and ready to go. And that might be looking after your sleep making sure you're eating and drinking well, all this kind of real basic self-care stuff that really feeds into that physiological side of being resilient. I think is really important.
Yeah, make using any episode of self-isolation as an opportunity to really hopefully get yourself in a strong position so you're ready to go back to work and hit the ground running.
Yeah. And I was chatting to someone earlier today as well about sort of narrating these experiences, and trying to put it into some kind of story in order. And I think that could be, I'm not saying it would work for everyone, but I think this kind of the journaling or the storylining of what's going on could be quite helpful as well, and just provide in these sort of dynamic and fairly frantic situations, it can just provide a bit of order, and something to look back on when it's all done, because it's going to be over and there's going to be this kind of come down of adrenaline and all this sort of stuff that after these like really busy periods where it might feel a bit surreal, but knowing what the journey has been to that point might be quite helpful for lots of people.
Yeah, great. Well, yeah, check out Nathan's site. So it's supporttheworkers.org. Thank you so much for your time, Nathan. It's been great to chat to you.
Cheers, Will. Thanks for having me.
No worries.